Her voice cracked like a whip across the stage. Candace Owens was not speaking. The microphone strained under the force of her words. Each syllable sharpened into an accusation meant to slice through the room. Cameras tilted forward, hungry to capture the moment. The crowd packed shoulder to shoulder and the overheated hall froze, as if a lightning strike had just landed among them. Every insult was flung with the conviction of someone certain that sheer volume could replace reason. She leaned forward, eyes narrowed, hands gesturing in frantic arcs, determined to dominate not only the stage, but the narrative. To some it looked like power, but to others it was desperation dressed in bravado. The echo of her fury rolled into the rafters, and for a heartbeat. The space felt less like a debate hall and more like an arena, where only one voice was allowed to matter. But then something happened. The silence. It wasn't the silence of agreement, nor the silence of awe. It was the silence of disbelief, the collective inhalation of an audience watching a line being crossed. Phones lifted in unison, tiny red lights blinking as streams began to ripple. Across social media, gasps scattered through the room, mixed with awkward laughter. While a few cheers tried and failed to drown out the unease, and at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even raise her hand. She simply waited. Her expression was unreadable, her stillness almost unnerving in the face of so much noise. While Owens's fury surged like a storm, Crockett was the calm before it, the kind of calm that unsettles more than shouting ever could. Some in the audience leaned forward, almost willing her to respond, while others looked away, unsure if she would even survive the verbal onslaught. Owens thought the silence meant victory. What she couldn't see was the patience behind Crockett's eyes, the gathering of composure that would soon become its own weapon. The crowd braced. The nation leaned closer to their screens, and every heartbeat in the room seemed to drum out the same question: would Crockett fire back or fold under the weight of the attack? No one knew. No one could predict it. But what happened next left the entire hallland, the country, utterly stunned. This was never just a debate between two women. It was a clash of worlds, two visions of America colliding in real time under the blinding heat of stage lights and the relentless glare of millions watching from their phones. Candace Owens had built a career on being loud enough to drown out questions, sharp enough to intimidate opponents into retreat. She thrived on chaos, feeding off outrage like oxygen. To her followers, volume was strength, and strength was all that mattered. But Jasmine Crockett had stepped into this arena with something different. She wasn't armed with firestorms of rhetoric or applause lines rehearsed for television sound bites. She carried something quieter, something that didn't always make headlines, but struck deeper when it did. A commitment to truth, to dignity, to the steady power of facts delivered without venom. Crockett represented a new kind of leadership, one that didn't mistake cruelty for courage. That's why the stakes were so high. This moment was never about who could shout the loudest. It was about what kind of politics America wanted to see reflected back at itself. Would rage and manipulation continue to dominate, or would composure, clarity, and calm finally stand their ground? Every eye in the room felt the weight of that choice. The college students in the front rows, phones raised like shields. The older audience members shifting uncomfortably as Owens's voice ricocheted around them. The journalists already drafting headlines in their minds. Everyone sensed that something larger was unfolding. For Crockett, this was more than a stage. It was a battlefield against an entrenched pattern of arrogance that had too often gone unchecked. Owens wasn't just attacking her. She was embodying a system that believed silencing, shaming, and steamrolling opponents was the path to victory. And here stood Crockett, the relative newcomer, daring to believe that patience and principle could still carve out space in the noise. It would have been easy, so easy for Crockett to respond in kind, to meet fire with fire, volume with volume. Many in the audience might even have expected it, almost craved it, as though watching two storms collide would be the real entertainment. But Crockett understood something deeper. The louder you shout, the less people remember your words. The calmer you remain, the sharper your message cuts. That was the gamble she was making, not just for herself, But for everyone watching who had ever felt spoken over, dismissed, or drowned out, her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. She wasn't absorbing Owens's fury because she had nothing to say. She was absorbing it because she knew that timing, precision, and dignity could deliver a blow no scream could ever match. The camera zoomed tighter, the tension stretching thinner by the second. This was more than a test of temperament. It was a referendum on values. What kind of America the crowd, by extension the country, wanted to cheer for. And though no one in the room could articulate it yet, they could feel it in their bones. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a turning point. A skirmish that symbolized a larger war between chaos and clarity, arrogance and grace, spectacle and truth. What would unfold in the next 10 minutes would ripple across America, replayed endlessly on timelines, dissected in classrooms, and remembered long after the stage lights dimmed, because one woman's fury had met its match not in louder fury, but in the still, gathering force of a reply the entire nation was about to hear. Asterisk. Candace Owens did not arrive on that stage by accident. She had spent years perfecting her brand, carving out a reputation as one of the most polarizing voices in modern politics. For her fans, she was a warrior, relentless, uncompromising, a voice that claimed to say what others are too afraid to say. For her critics, she was a provocateur and opportunist who thrived not on solutions, but on spectacle. Either way, Owens had mastered the art of turning controversy into currency. It started with viral clips, her voice raised, her eyes flashing with fury, her words designed not to persuade, but to provoke. Each outburst traveled faster than the last, clipped into 30-second bursts that ricocheted across Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. The formula was simple: attack, inflame, and dominate the room until no other voice could breathe. It wasn't about debate. It was about performance. In those performances, Owens cultivated an aura of unshakable confidence. She walked onto every stage as if the spotlight already belonged to her, her smirk suggesting she had already won before the first word was spoken. To the untrained eye, it looked like power. No, but to those who watched more closely, it was something else. Arrogance, disguised as certainty, insecurity, masked by volume. Her contradictions only deepened the mystique. She had once criticized the very movements she later aligned herself with. She had denounced identity politics while building a persona entirely around her own identity as a weapon against opponents. One moment she spoke of unity, the next she reveled in division, but none of it mattered. Not really. What mattered was that she stayed in the headlines, stayed on the feeds, stayed louder than anyone else in the room, and for a long time it worked. On college campuses, on cable panels, in congressional hearings, Owens perfected her role as the attack dog, the disruptor, where she would interrupt with a smirk, roll her eyes with theatrical timing, and lean into the microphone with a force that seemed to dare her opponent to push back. They hesitated, even for a second. She pounced, her voice rising, her words cascading like a waterfall no one could dam. The audience would laugh, clap, or gasp, and Owens would bask in it, certain she had landed another blow. It was a style that left little room for nuance, but plenty of space for spectacle. Owens didn't need her audience to remember her points. She just needed them to remember her presence. In a media landscape obsessed with moments that trend, she became a generator of them, provoking, attacking, and ensuring that when the dust settled, her face was the one plastered across screens. But there was a darker side to that strategy, because behind the theatrics, Owens had built herself into a figure many saw as less of a truth-teller and more of a manipulator. Her critics accused her of playing to whichever narrative would grant her the loudest applause. Her contradictions weren't slips, they were tactics. And while the performance made her powerful, it also made her fragile because it required constant escalation. Each outburst had to top the last, each insult sharper, each tirade more shocking. The moment she met someone who refused to play her game, performance risked collapsing under its own weight. And on that stage, for that audience, that someone was Jasmine Crockett. Because what Owens didn't expect was resistance without rage. She was prepared for shouting matches, for interruptions, the kind of heated back and forth that could be spliced into a viral clip of Candace shutting down her opponent. But she wasn't prepared for silence. She wasn't prepared for composure. She wasn't prepared for an opponent who refused to get dragged into the mud. For years, her strategy had been the same: overwhelm with volume, unsettle with confidence, and wait for her adversary to lose their footing. Time and again, it worked. But Crockett was different. She didn't flinch. She didn't stumble. She didn't take the bait. And that single decision, simply to remain calm, was enough to begin unraveling the persona Owens had spent years constructing. Because what is arrogance, if not fragile? What is fury, if it finds no target to land on? What happens to a performance when the audience begins to see through the act? Candace Owens had walked onto that stage believing she already owned it. She had delivered the scream, the outburst, the fury she thought would guarantee her dominance. But this time, her fury met an immovable force, and what happened next would reveal just how brittle her armor truly was, long before she ever stepped under the bright lights of a national stage. Jasmine Crockett had already been fighting battles that demanded more courage than volume. Her journey did not begin in the glittering world of televised debates, nor in the polished halls of power where cameras click and sound bites are born. It began in courtrooms with peeling paint, in neighborhoods too often forgotten, and in conversations. Where justice wasn't a lofty principle, it was a desperate necessity. Crockett's path started in law, but not the kind that padded resumes or promised quick prestige. She took on the cases others overlooked: tenants pushed out of their homes, workers denied wages, citizens abused by systems meant to protect them. These weren't glamorous battles. They were grueling, emotional, and often thankless.
At Crockett
believed that if the law meant anything at all, it had to mean something for those who couldn't afford to buy influence or airtime. As an activist, she carried that same conviction into the streets. She stood shoulder to shoulder with communities demanding change, not as a distant politician, but as someone who knew the stakes personally. She didn't just speak for people, she spoke with them, often being the lone figure in a room insisting. That dignity was not negotiable. The grit of those years etched something unshakable into her character, a steadiness born not of privilege, but of persistence. When Crockett eventually ran for office, few gave her a real chance. She wasn't backed by vast political machines or showered with endless donations. She was, in every sense, the underdog. But she carried into the campaign the same energy she carried into the courtroom: a refusal to be intimidated. A refusal to stay silent when silence meant injustice would win. And slowly, people began to see her not just as a candidate, but as a vessel for their own voices. Her victory wasn't just electoral, it was personal. It proved that someone who built a career on service rather than spectacle could still carve out space in a system often rigged for the loudest and the wealthiest. Yet even as she rose to the level of Congresswoman, Crockett never abandoned the grounding that had carried her there. She walked into the Capitol with the same values she carried into the courtroom: to fight for people who had been silenced, to hold on to integrity even when the cameras weren't watching, to remind herself daily who she was really serving. That's what made her so different from opponents like Candace Owens. While Owens thrived on performance, Crockett had been forged in sacrifice. Every late night spent drafting briefs, every hard-fought case against powerful landlords or indifferent bureaucracies, every protest where she risked her own safety, it all built a foundation of resolve. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And real has a way of resonating, even in a room filled with noise. Her composure on that debate stage wasn't an accident. It wasn't the product of media training or a rehearsed strategy crafted by consultants. It was the natural extension of her life. When you sat across from a family who has lost everything and asked you to fight anyway, you learn that flinching is a luxury. When you've stood in front of a jury knowing the odds are stacked against your client but refusing to give up, you learn that steadiness is power. And when you've looked into the eyes of your community and promised them you won't bend to arrogance or corruption, you learn that dignity can silence even the loudest voices. For Crockett, integrity wasn't a slogan, it was survival. It was the thread that tied together every chapter of her story. She didn't shout because she didn't need to. She didn't grandstand because she didn't have to. Her authority didn't come from the volume of her voice, but from the weight of her journey. That's why, as Candace Owens screamed across the stage, Crockett could remain still. That's why, when the crowd shifted uncomfortably and cameras zoomed in, she didn't lose herself in the spectacle. She had faced louder storms before, storms that didn't end when the lights dimmed or the cameras cut away. And in those storms, she had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Calm is not weakness. Calm is preparation. Calm is power. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every uphill battle had prepared her for this one moment. This wasn't just another debate. It was a stage where the values she had lived would finally collide with the arrogance she had opposed all her life. And as the room held its breath, waiting to see if she would break under the weight of Owens's fury, Crockett sat grounded in the knowledge that she had already fought harder battles and already won. What came next wasn't just a reply. It was the culmination of a lifetime of resilience, and the beginning of a moment the nation would never forget. The air in the hall was already heavy with tension, but Candace Owens wasn't finished. Her voice, sharp and relentless, rose again, cutting through the murmurs of the audience like a blade. She paced slightly across the stage, gesturing with wide sweeps of her hand, as though volume and movement could cement her dominance. Every word dripped with mockery, every pause calculated to draw laughter or jeers from her supporters, scattered through the crowd. "You see," she sneered, "this is exactly what I've been saying. People like Representative Crockett can't handle the truth. They hide behind polished talking points. They crumble when confronted with real fire. Isn't that right, Congresswoman? Or are you just going to sit there pretending you have something to say?" The crowd stirred uneasily. A ripple of low voices moved through the seats, some chuckling at Owens's taunt, others shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. A few called out encouragement, while others shook their heads, whispering about the spectacle unraveling before them. The debate was supposed to be an exchange of ideas. Dead, it was becoming a trial by fire, staged in front of a nation glued to their screens. Crockett did not move. She didn't rise to the bait, didn't flinch at the insult. She let the words wash over her, as steady and unmoving as stone against the tide. Her eyes remained fixed, her hands folded loosely in front of her. That silence, that refusal to feed the fury only seemed to enrage Owens further. "Look at her," Owens snapped, pointing toward Crockett. "She can't even defend herself." This is what happens when you put unqualified, unprepared people in positions of power. They freeze. They fold. They sit there waiting for someone else to save them. Pathetic. Gasps broke through the audience this time, louder, sharper. It wasn't just a line crossed. It was a plunge into outright disdain. Phones tilted higher, red recording lights blinking like watchful eyes. Social media was already filling with hashtags, clips, and commentary. People across the country were watching this unfold in real time, debating whether they were witnessing a bold takedown or a public meltdown. Crockett blinked once, slowly. Her silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate, almost confrontational in its calm. The contrast between the two women grew more striking with every passing second. Owens's fury versus Crockett's composure, chaos versus control. The audience could feel the polarity pulling them in opposite directions. The murmurs swelled into a buzz, the kind of collective energy that builds when people sense something monumental about to happen. Some leaned forward on the edge of their seats, whispering that Crockett needed to fire back before it was too late. Others watched in awe, wondering how long her composure could hold. And Owens, feeding off the attention, pushed harder. She interrupted every attempt at moderation, talking over not only her opponent, but the very structure of the debate itself. She laughed at her own insults, trying to coax the audience into laughter with her, but each attempt seemed to land more awkwardly, more forced, as if the crowd was beginning to see through the performance. Still, Crockett remained unmoved. Her patience became its own weapon, her silence a mirror that reflected back the pettiness of every jab. To some it looked like restraint. To others, it looked like quiet defiance. Either way, the energy in the hall was shifting, tilting away from Owens's bluster and toward Crockett's unshakable calm. It was a dangerous gamble, this waiting. Each second stretched thin, each breath measured. But Crockett knew the weight of timing. She had seen it in courtrooms, in community meetings, in the slow, grinding gears of justice. Sometimes the most powerful response is not the first one. It's the one that arrives after the storm has spent itself. When silence has sharpened the blade of truth, the room had reached its breaking point. The insults, the interruptions, the mocking laughter, all of it built into a crescendo that demanded release. The tension was unbearable, the crowd restless, the nation watching with bated breath. And then the explosion everyone was waiting for. The moment arrived in a silence, so thick it seemed. The entire hall had forgotten how to breathe. Candace Owens stood on the edge of her own fury, flushed, chest heaving with adrenaline, her smirk trembling under the weight of expectation. She believed she had cornered her opponent, that her storm of insults had forced Jasmine Crockett into submission. But what Owens mistook for retreat was something else entirely. Preparation. Crockett straightened slightly. Subtle movement that nonetheless shifted the entire room's attention. She adjusted the microphone with deliberate care, letting the scraping sound echo like a drum roll. And then she paused. Not long, not awkwardly, just long enough to turn the silence into suspense. The kind of pause that made every person in the room lean forward, straining for the first syllable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and devastatingly clear. "Candace," she began, her tone even almost conversational. "I've spent my entire career listening to people yell. Landlords yelling at tenants, corporations yelling at workers, politicians yelling at the very citizens they're supposed to serve. And do you know what I've learned?" Another pause. The audience held its breath. "The louder someone yells," Crockett continued, "the more it reveals what they don't have. They don't have facts. They don't have solutions. All they have is volume. Volume doesn't build a country. It only drowns out the people who actually make it strong." Gasps rippled through the hall, followed quickly by applause. Wasn't a roar, yet more like the first crack in a dam, but it was enough to shift the energy. Owens blinked, caught off guard by the precision of the strike. Crockett didn't let the momentum slip. She pressed on, her cadence slow and deliberate, each phrase landing with the force of a gavel. "You've called me unqualified. You've mocked my service. But here's what you can't mock. The families I've defended in court, the workers I've stood beside when their wages were stolen, the communities I've fought for when no one else would. That's not weakness, that's leadership. And if you think screaming makes you strong, then you've never understood what real strength looks like." The applause swelled this time, louder, bolder. Phones in the crowd shot higher, capturing every word, every gesture. Hashtags were already forming online, clips spreading before Crockett had even finished her sentence. Owens tried to interject, her mouth twitching with the start of a rebuttal. But Crockett held up one hand, not angrily, not dismissively, but firmly, like a judge quieting a courtroom. The gesture was small, yet it carried more authority than all of Owens's shouting combined. "Candace," Crockett said softly, "I'm not here to outshell you. I'm here to outlast you. And the difference is this. When the cameras turn off and the stage lights dim, my work continues. Yours ends the moment the outrage cycle resets." The room erupted. Cheers, whistles, clapping that reverberated off. The walls, it wasn't just approval, it was release. The audience had endured the storm, and now they had found their anchor. Crockett's composure wasn't just impressive, it was liberating. Owens rattled, attempted to recover. She leaned into the microphone, fumbling for her trademark bravado. Typical politician response, she scoffed, forcing a laugh. Hide behind, but the crowd wasn't with her anymore. The laughter she expected fell flat, drowned out by the echo of Crockett's words still hanging in the air. Her smirk faltered. Her eyes darted nervously across the room, searching for validation that no longer came. Crockett pressed on, her voice steady. her rhythm unbreakable. Asterisk, you say, I can't handle the truth. But the truth is this. America doesn't need more performers. It doesn't need more shouting. It needs people willing to listen, to act, to fight for others without needing to humiliate them. That's not just politics. That's humanity. And I refuse to sacrifice mine just to make a headline. The audience leapt to its feet. Applause thundered now, filling every corner of the hall.
Wait.
Strangers clapped shoulders. Some shouted her name. Others simply stood in stunned silence, moved by the dignity of the takedown. Owens's face betrayed the unraveling. The forced smirk collapsed into a tight-lipped frown, her posture stiff, her eyes flickering with frustration. She attempted another retort, but each word stumbled, falling flat against the tidal wave of support Crockett had summoned. To regain control only made her look smaller, more desperate, more exposed. And Crockett, she didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She simply stood in the calm she had carried from the beginning, letting the crowd do what her words had unleashed. She didn't need to spike the ball. Her composure was victory enough. For years, Candace Owens had thrived on dominating stages, silencing opponents, commanding the narrative. But in this moment, before this audience, her strategy collapsed. Because rage is powerful only when it isn't met with something stronger. And tonight it was. As the cheers rolled on, Crockett closed with a single line, her voice cutting through the noise like a final strike of lightning. When arrogance screams, she said, dignity whispers and wins. The eruption was instantaneous. The audience didn't just clap, they roared, a standing ovation that shook the stage. Crockett's words spread like wildfire across the internet, clipped and replayed, echoed and praised. What had begun as a barrage of insults ended as a masterclass in composure. Candace Owens had screamed. Jasmine Crockett had replied with calm precision. And in that contrast, the balance of power shifted, not just for the night, but for the narrative that would follow. The villain's fury had met an immovable force, and the aftershocks of that collision were only beginning. The sound of applause still echoed in the hall long after the cameras cut away. But the real explosion began the moment those clips hit the internet. Within minutes, timelines flooded with Crockett's calm reply, replayed over and over like a highlight reel of poetic justice. Hashtags trended at lightning speed. Hashtag.com crushes chaos. Hashtag Jasmine wins. Hashtag dignity over drama. Memes surfaced in second Owens's contorted face, mid-shout, plastered next to Crockett's serene posture, captioned with lines like volume does not equal victory. TikTok creators remixed her pause, that devastating silence before she spoke, turning it into the new symbol of composure under fire. Twitter threads unraveled every word of Crockett's reply, analyzing it like scripture. She didn't just debate one viral post read, she disarmed. Another commentator wrote, that was the difference between performative outrage and principled power. Crockett showed us what leadership feels like. Even critics who normally dismissed her found themselves grudgingly admitting that the moment had shifted the dynamic. One conservative pundit wrote, I don't agree with Crockett on anything, but she handled Owens better than anyone I've ever seen. Celebrities amplified it. Actors, musicians, athletes all lending their platforms to the clip. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted simply, teach me that level of patience. Queen energy. A comedian turned it into a viral sketch, exaggerating. Owens is screaming, only to freeze-frame Crockett's stillness with the words, be like Jasmine. Within hours, Crockett wasn't just trending, she was ascendant. Transformed from a congresswoman with a growing profile into a cultural figurehead. Of dignity in the face of chaos. But the power of the moment wasn't just in the entertainment value. Commentators on political panels leaned in, dissecting the exchange as more than a clapback. It became shorthand for a deeper cultural yearning, proof that calm could cut deeper than outrage. That truth could withstand the storm of manufactured fury. On morning shows, anchors played the clip on repeat, each time marveling at how one measured sentence from Crockett silenced a career debater renowned for her verbal brutality. Something happened here, one anchor said. We've seen Candace Owens dominate debates for years, but tonight it wasn't volume, that won it was restraint. And that restraint may be the new language people are craving for progressives, especially those from immigrant communities and marginalized backgrounds. Crockett's triumph resonated on a visceral level. She represented not just a politician, but a symbol of survival in a world where dignity is often the only shield against systemic arrogance. The memes were funny, the hashtags were clever, but beneath the humor was validation. Validation that being calm, being principled, being rooted in service could still triumph over the theatrics of rage. And perhaps most telling of all was the silence from Owens herself. Normally quick to flood her own channels with counter-narratives, memes, and taunts, she hesitated. Her usual army of defenders seemed muted, unsure how to spin the footage that everyone had already seen with their own eyes. When she finally responded days later, it came in the form of a clipped post insisting the crowd was biased and the media unfair, but by then, the narrative was out of her hands. The internet had crowned its victor. For Crockett, the night altered her trajectory. No longer just a rising voice in Congress. She became the embodiment of something bigger, a cultural yearning for leaders who lead with integrity rather than spectacle. Her inbox overflowed with interview requests. Her quotes appeared on posters in classrooms, even as motivational content shared across immigrant and grassroots networks worldwide. In living rooms and workplaces, people repeated her lines when arrogance screams, dignity whispers, and wins like a mantra. The moment crystallized into more than a debate highlight. It became a metaphor for a wider cultural shift, a rejection of manufactured chaos, a hunger for steadiness in an era of noise. Owens had been the perfect foil, the avatar of rage disguised as confidence. Crockett's response wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a declaration that there was another way to hold power, another way to fight back without losing one's grounding, as days turned into weeks. The clip didn't fade. Instead, it embedded itself in the ongoing story of America, played alongside footage of protests, paired with discussions about civility and politics, invoked as proof that a new kind of leadership might be possible. For young people especially, women of color watching the exchange, it wasn't just political theater. It was personal, but beyond the memes, beyond the standing ovations, beyond even the headlines. There lingered a deeper question, one that would soon emerge as the real lesson of that night. Because what happened on that stage wasn't just about Candace Owens losing her grip or Jasmine Crockett winning the moment. It was about something larger, waiting to be uncovered. And as the shockwaves continued to ripple, one truth became clear. The battle had only just begun. Asterisk in the days after the clash. As the noise of social media slowly gave way to reflection, Jasmine Crockett herself reframed what had unfolded. She didn't gloat. She didn't spike the football. She didn't even waste her energy on Owens's insults. Instead, in an interview that would later be clipped and shared just as widely as the original exchange, she looked straight into the camera and said, "When arrogance screams, composure whispers and wins." That one sentence distilled the entire confrontation into a truth that resonated far beyond politics. It wasn't about two women trading barbs on stage. It was about a choice in how we confront injustice, disrespect, and manipulation. Crockett showed that dignity isn't weakness. In fact, dignity is power, an unshakable center that can withstand storms of fury and still emerge unbroken. The lesson rang especially loud for communities long forced to navigate spaces where their voices were dismissed or shouted down. Crockett's composure became a beacon. She proved you don't have to outshout your opponent to win, you just have to outlast them with principle. Rage is loud, yes, but it burns fast. Dignity, on the other hand, endures. This wasn't only a personal victory for Jasmine Crockett, it was a symbolic triumph for everyone who had ever been silenced, mocked, or underestimated. In that moment, she embodied justice without theatrics, truth without venom, resilience without cruelty. She didn't need to humiliate her opponent because her restraint did the work. Leaders, activists, and everyday people took note. In schools, teachers replayed her response as an example of grace under pressure. Community groups cited her words in workshops about conflict resolution. Even faith leaders pointed to her as a modern parable, a demonstration that humility paired with conviction can outshine arrogance cloaked in confidence. But Crockett herself resisted being painted as a superhero. She reminded people that her calm was not born overnight. It came from years of practicing patience in courtrooms, of listening to constituents in crisis, learning that real power isn't in the volume of your voice, but in the steadiness of your spirit. Her victory was not the victory of one, but of many, the accumulation of lessons carried forward by those who taught her resilience and demanded her integrity. And so, the moral lesson of that night stretched far beyond a single viral clip. It wasn't just about silencing Candace Owens. It was about reimagining leadership in a culture drowning in outrage. Crockett gave the public a vision of what it looks like when strength wears the face of composure, when truth doesn't need to shout, and when justice can be as quiet as a pause before a perfectly timed reply for millions watching. The inspiration was deeply personal. It said to the immigrant worker who swallows insults to keep a job, "Your dignity is not weakness." Said to the young activist dismissed in classrooms, "Your calm is your power." Said to every person of color told to tone it down, "Restraint does not mean surrender." By the time the dust settled, what lingered wasn't the sound of Candace's screams, it was the silence Crockett commanded. A silence that spoke louder than rage, that filled the hall, that crossed screens, that entered living rooms, that reminded people of an old truth reborn in modern form. Dignity wins. Always. And that was the deeper current of the story. Not a viral debate, not a trending hashtag, but a collective realization when arrogance screams. Composure whispers and whispers last longer. The crowd that night had seen more than a clash of personalities. They had glimpsed the possibility of a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in theatrics, but in integrity. And as Crockett's words continued to echo across America, they became more than a response to Candace Owens. They became a blueprint for a generation, hungry for leaders who refused to mirror the chaos they face. It was not just Crockett's victory. It was dignity's victory. And the world, for a moment, felt the shift. Candace Owens may have tried to own the stage with her shouting, but in the end, it wasn't rage that captured history's attention. It was JasmineCrockett's.com. The very title of this story rings true. Calm defeating chaos, dignity disarming, arrogance. That is the lesson people will remember long after the echoes of that scream fade into silence. Because what America needs right now isn't another shouting match. It isn't more fuel for the fire of division. What this moment proved is that the nation doesn't need louder voices. It needs stronger truths. Stronger truths rarely come from those who bark the loudest. They come from those who stand rooted, unshaken, ready to face the storm without becoming the storm. Crockett's composure showed us all that leadership is not about decibels, but about depth. It's not about the noise you make, but about the integrity you hold. And in an era drowning in chaos, that example has never felt more urgent. So here's the call. If you believe in dignity over division, if you believe in truth over manipulation, if you believe that calm power is the antidote to chaos, then don't let this story stop here. Share it. Spread it. Let the echoes of Crockett's composure reach further than the scream that tried to overshadow her. Because every time we lift up stories of dignity triumphing over arrogance, we remind the world that justice still has a voice, and it doesn't need to shout to be heard. The lesson is clear.